So each big circle represents the overall average center of mass of the entire thing. Okay? And so the way I want you to picture this is you've got these little J1 and J2, so it's under the big circle in that first picture. So J1 and J2. I want you to think of this as an arm. So that top picture, we've got a straight arm. J1 is going to be joint 1. That's going to be shoulder joint. So this first bar will be the upper arm that you're looking at. And then J2 underneath will be your elbow joint, so joint 2. And then the furthest bar will be the lower arm. Okay. And so we're going to be moving this segment around. Okay, so at full extension, top picture, we've got the overall average center of mass is pretty much right in between the two because they're pretty spaced out equivalently. If we go into position number 2, into about 90 degrees of flexion, you'll see that each individual center of mass doesn't change, okay, because they're fixed in the object themselves, but the overall center of mass does change. Okay, so it shifts a little bit closer because I brought all this lower arm mass closer as I flexed. As I go to position 3 and flex fully up, this shifts even closer because I've now brought all of this mass closer to that shoulder joint. Okay. And so that's important because what that tells us is that while we may not be able to manipulate the center of mass of an individual segment, when we take a collective average of segments, we can. So think back to when you were calculating center of mass of the body at anatomical neutral, it's around that belly button, right? That is the collective average of the body, which means you raise your arms up, that center of mass is going to go up. Put your arms to the side, that center of mass is going to shift to the side. So we can manipulate that. And that is important, okay? It's really important when we start talking about how we manipulate moment of inertia in full body movements. So let's talk about a couple of them. We have 2 examples here of how we can apply this. A figure skater example and a sprinting example. So let's start with the sprinter. One of the earliest running mechanics taught in sprinting, so not necessarily like distance running or longer distance, slower speed running, but short duration, high speed running. Okay. They are taught to flex that knee during the swing phase. So when that foot is off the ground taking a step, flex that knee as much as they possibly can. Okay. That's one of the things they are taught to do. And the reason for that is to manipulate the moment of inertia. So think about this leg, this lower body segment, the way we just talked about this. Okay? But instead now just picture J1 as the hip joint, J2 as the knee joint, and you are trying to flex that up as much as possible. So you're trying to get here. Okay? What does that do? When we flex that knee as much as possible, we are bringing all the mass up. Okay, so we're bringing the center of mass up, closer to the body. When you are sprinting, running, stepping, whatever it is, and that leg is rotating forward, what's the axis of rotation during that step? It's that hip joint. Okay? So think back to moment of inertia and radius of gyration. It's the distance from the axis of rotation, the hip joint, to the center of mass of the object. So when you maximally flex that knee way up, you're shifting the center of mass closer, decreasing the moment of inertia, making it easier to rotate that leg through. So you can swing that leg through faster. Okay? And so that's why they're taught to do that. So they're taught to flex it as much as possible, decrease the moment of inertia of that leg, making it easier to swing through. Just like you were doing when you rotated your object. They're trying to do that with their leg every single step, to be able to run and transition from a step as quickly as possible. Okay? For the figure skater, we have the example of them going into a spin. Okay, if you've ever watched figure skating, you'll see them, they start to go into a tuck and a spin. As they do that, everything comes in tight. Okay, so the arms tuck in, everything comes in, and they start to spin. And as they do that, what happens? They start to spin faster. They pick up speed. Okay? So think here, the axis of rotation of the figure skater. Essentially, you're spinning a top, okay? And they're spinning on the very point of that top, which in this one is the blade of the skate. So essentially, it's the midline of the body. And so as we tuck everything in tight, we're bringing all the mass in as close to that midline as possible. Again, decreasing that moment of inertia, which means it is going to be easier to spin. Okay. As they start to come out of the spin, the arms come back out, spreading that mass back out. Moment of inertia starts to go back up. They're going to start to slow down. And that brings us to an important piece from a minute ago, angular momentum. Remember, if we go back, angular momentum was moment of inertia and angular velocity. Now, remember back to our previous conversation in linear momentum, where we talked about the principle of the conservation of momentum. We said that the overall momentum is conserved. It stays the same, which means in here, same thing. Overall momentum is going to stay the same. But that happens between a trade-off of these two guys. So moment of inertia and angular velocity can change. So here we see that in this example. We talked about the figure skater. Everything tucks in, moment of inertia decreases. If that is decreasing and the overall momentum has to stay the same, what's the other variable that has to increase to compensate for that? Angular velocity. Okay. And so as they tuck in and they start to spin, what happens? You see them, they pick up speed, they start to spin faster. Because the physics dictates that because the moment of inertia is going down and the momentum has to stay constant, velocity has to increase. So they are manipulating laws of physics to spin faster in that tuck position. As the arms come out, as they come out of that spin, moment of inertia starts to come back up. For overall momentum to stay the same, that means velocity has to start to come back down. So these are always going to be having a trade-off between moment of inertia and angular velocity. So that's the angular version of Newton's first law, inertia. Okay, so talk about how hard it is to rotate something, what makes it easier to rotate something. Newton's second law. Okay, so the second law, still the law of acceleration, but now we're talking about angular accelerations. And we're talking about torque. Okay, so an angular force producing motion. Sometimes you'll hear about that going to say torque. Sometimes you'll hear them say a moment. So if they say a moment or torque, for our purposes, those are synonymous terms. Okay, there's very nuanced differences that you don't need to worry about. But if you hear me say a torque or a moment, you're talking about the angular effect of a force. So an angular force. And so with torque or a moment, we're talking about when you apply that push or pull on an object that we talked about before, a linear force, what type of rotation is it actually going to cause to an object? That's what we're talking about with torque. So the rotational effect or the turning effect of a force. And there's two major factors that dictate how that works. We mentioned them a little bit in the last PowerPoint. We're going to get into a little bit more now. The two factors are where the force is applied on the object and the angle that that force is applied at. Okay, so let's start with the angle. So we're going to start with this graph to the left. It's a bit of a busy graph, so let's talk about what we got. On the x-axis, we have angle from the perpendicular. And you've got a 0-degree angle in 10, 20, 30, 40, up to 90 degrees from perpendicular. What that means is that at 0, we are applying a force perfectly perpendicular to the object. And as we start to go up in degrees, we're starting to come in at more and more and more and more of an angle applying that force until we get to 90, where we are applying a perfectly parallel force. It's the right into it. That's all we're talking about here. And then you've got the percentage of the force that produces torque, or that produces rotation. And so what you'll see is that a perfectly perpendicular force, almost 100% is going to create rotation. Meaning if you're holding it here, perfectly perpendicular, a lot of rotation. Hold it that same way, come all the way to the other end of the spectrum, parallel force, almost none of it creates rotation. So there, it's basically no rotation. Okay. So the more of a 90-degree angle you can come in at, the more rotation you're going to get when you push or pull, applying force to an object. The second factor is where the force is applied. And so for this one, you've got the little cartoon wrenches here, and the perfect example I want you to see is that we've got where this is going to be rotating here on both, and then the further away on this we get to apply the force, the bigger the torque is going to be created. Okay, so when we apply a force further out from that axis of rotation, it creates a bigger rotational effect. And that brings us to, hopefully, a term that you have heard before in other classes, a lever arm. Okay, because that's what a lever arm is. So a lever arm is a distance, again, it's another distance measurement. It is the distance from the axis of rotation of an object to where the force is applied on the object. Okay. So a lever arm, again, is the distance from the axis of rotation to where the force is applied on the object. Now, let's talk about a couple of examples of that. So the one I like to use the most is doorknobs. Why do they get put where they do? Okay. So when we talk about this, we've got 3 examples. So door number 1, door number 2, and door number 3. Where's the axis of rotation on a door? Okay. It's at the hinges of the door, where it's going to swing open and close. And then where, when you go to open a door, are you going to push or pull on the door, applying your force, usually at the handle. As you twist or rotate the handle, that's where you're going to push or pull on the door. Okay, so that's your point of force application. And so with those two, we can create a distance from axis of rotation to that point of force application. So this horizontal line across the door is your lever arm. Okay. And the bigger the lever arm, the bigger the advantage you get of producing rotation of the door. Okay. So the reason it's way out here at the far end of the other door is to make it easier for us. We don't want to have to work hard to open and close a door. We want to be able to just barely push or barely pull, and that door swing open easily. And when we have a big lever arm, it provides us a mechanical advantage so that we put in a little bit of force, we get a big rotation out of that. In door number 2, we've shifted this much closer to the center of the door. The lever arm is much shorter, okay? Which means we are now going to have to work harder. We're going to have to push on this door harder to make it actually open up because we don't have as much of an advantage from that big lever arm. Same in door number 3, it's even closer, even shorter lever arm. Now that lever arm is short, so you have to push even harder to make that door rotate and open. The example I use of this all the time is if you've ever been on the Statesboro campus of Georgia Southern and you go over to the Student Union, the doors that are there seem, especially the outside doors, all seem very backwards to me. And I see a lot of people walk up to open them on the wrong side of the door. They walk up, they go to push the door open, they're on the wrong side. The door barely moves because they were expecting this, where they get the big advantage of a lever arm, don't have to push very hard, and they got this. And the door basically just pushes them right back and it doesn't open. So then they get embarrassed, go to the other side of the door, and be on the way. So that's the first part of lever arms and the advantage they give us. The second example of a lever arm I want to talk about are lifting. Okay, so most people have heard it, they've been told it, you've told it to somebody, maybe yourself. Lift with your legs, not with your back, which is good advice, but let's talk about mechanically why that is the case. So this is not a muscle strength question or anything like that. This is simply a mechanics question, okay, and why this matters. So usually when we talk about this and this gets brought up, it's said so that people don't hurt themselves, specifically when they're lifting, that they don't hurt their back, their low back. Okay, so that's going to be the axis of rotation kind of interest for us here. Is as they are going to lift this up, that rotation there and the torque produced on the back. And then here we've got a few things going on. You've got all these little dark circles representing the mass of lots of body segments here. So we've got the low back, we've got the trunk of the body, the arm, and we've got the box that we're going to lift. So all these different masses of things that we're having to overcome just to stand and lift. We've got these arrows coming down, so these vertical forces coming down from each one of those body segments. Those are weight forces, so the weights of all of these. And then you'll see we have distances from that axis of rotation to each of those forces. Those are all lever arms. They're the distances from that axis of rotation, low back, to all these different weight forces that we are having to overcome just for the simple sense of lifting and standing up. So, think about this with me then. When you're told lift with your legs, not with your back, what does that make you do? Because when I tell you lift with your back, if I tell you to do that, I'm going to lift the chair with my back, that means I'm going to be generally further away from the chair. I'm going to kind of hinge at the hips, and I'm going to rotate it up there, okay? Which is not ideal. If I tell you lift with your legs, you're going to end up getting closer to the object, essentially squatting down to it and lifting it there, okay? So again, not necessarily a muscle strength question. We can talk about that if we want to, but that's not the point of this. When we do that and we get closer to the object, what happens to all of those lever arms involved? They all get shorter, as opposed to lifting with the back, because they're all further away. If they're further away, that means when we go to lift and apply forces, all the torques produced on that low back are bigger. And we don't want that. Okay, so in this example, we're trying to make these lever arms as small as possible so that when we have to produce force, the torque on the low back is as small as possible. Okay, so in the door example, we're trying to have a big lever arm, give us that advantage. Here, we're trying to have a smaller lever arm to decrease that torque on the back. So that is Newton's second angular law. Finally, to round us out here, Newton's third angular law. So law number 3, again, action-reaction. For the linear version, we said that for every applied force, there was an equal and opposite force. Very similar for angular. For every rotational force, every torque, there is a reactive torque. Okay. So if we applied a torque in a clockwise direction, the rotational, the reactional will be counterclockwise, and vice versa. Okay. My favorite examples usually of seeing this is if you've ever watched little kids run. Okay. But some adults do, but especially watching little kids run and when they try and run really fast. So they start to get faster and faster and faster and faster and faster, and almost inevitably, always, they get going too fast. What happens? Down. They get going too fast, they start to get out in front of their feet, and they just topple over. Okay. And that comes actually from not properly manipulating Newton's third law. And so one of the things that young kids are taught when learning to run, and again, runners in general, is that alternating pump of the arms and legs because of these reactive forces. Okay. So when you look here, if you rotate the leg forward like that, you're going to get the opposite force back on the upper body. Okay, so basically the other side of the joint. Same with when you rotate the arm forward, you're going to get a rotational force backwards on the body. And so the reason you're taught to alternate arm and leg and pump the arms opposite is to try and counteract those big forces of the legs. And so what ends up happening while you see the little kids fall is that the arms get out of sync of the legs, or the arms get tired and stop, and the legs take over, and as they pump, they essentially push you over. Okay, so that's what we're taught to do here with these. Okay, same of the Julio Jones picture here. If you're seeing somebody like this kind of sprinting down the sideline, tiptoeing the sideline, trying to stay in, a lot of times you'll see them leaning into the sideline to try and stay in, because as they lean that way, what they get back on then the lower half of the body is pushing them back in towards the field. So they're actively pushing themselves back by making that motion. Okay, so we're manipulating these reactive forces to try and create the motion that we want going forward. The video you have here is a fun video that I've incorporated in this ever since it popped up while I was putting this